So again, welcome back everyone and good afternoon. So again, I'm back here in our basic software training program here at Pixel8. And it is me again, Joshua G, the software engineering supervisor here at Pixel8. And I welcome you to this afternoon's basic software training program. Now, for those of you who just came here in our live stream, you can catch up our current topics by looking at the previous live stream sessions we have. You can check out the Pixel8 Academy page in order to backtrack as well as to check out the previous live streams. So for those of you who are still around, welcome back. So in this afternoon session, we will be tackling the advanced features of VueJs, namely the components, Vuex as well as Vue Router. So in our previous live stream, which is earlier in this morning, we tackled a bit about components, but we did not exactly explain them in proper detail. So in this afternoon session, we will be explaining to you what components are, and we will be discussing in full detail how to use them as well as its implementation. So we have sample codes as well for you to follow along. So in terms of Vuex as well as Vue Router, these are two plugins that are used alongside Vue in order to provide single-page application capabilities. Now, with that in mind, we will be teaching you how to use Vuex as well as in combination with Vue Router. Also, we will be using components, or we will be discussing components in a much more cleaner detail as compared to the previous session earlier this morning. So, I think we can now, wait, that's okay. So, let's see. So, without further ado, let's go back into our previously left topic, which is Vue.js. Okay, so, there you go. I think you can switch it off for now. You can switch it off the camera for now. So, let's see. So, okay. Again, so in this afternoon session, we will be tackling components as well as Vuex and Vue Router. So we have the Vuex and Vue Router in bold casing in order to emphasize that the two topics will be the focal point of this afternoon session. So let's jump a bit back and then let's tackle components. So what are components? Components are basically reusable Vue instances with a name. So imagine a single Vue file with a specific name, right? So every single Vue file is considered a component. That is how it is because you can attach every single Vue file to another Vue file in the form of a parent-child relationship. So that is how components are established in the context of Vue. Also, components can be used as a custom element. So in our previous live stream earlier, we used components as a custom element in our template tags in our Vue components, right? So we injected them alongside Vue components as well. So aside from those, data can also be passed to and from components, meaning you can pass data from the parent to the child as well as from the child back to the parent. So we tackled them in the previous live stream, but we will discuss here in full detail as to how it all works. So, how do you use components? So that is the question indeed. So, the first step in using component is, first, you need to import the component onto the script, which is this line right here, as you can see in the slide. So, first, we import the component onto the target Vue file. Next, the component is registered as a child component, meaning that when the parent component gets loaded, the child is also included. So after that, the next step would be the component is rendered inside the div. So as you can see here, the child component is now rendered inside the div component. So how do you pass data from and to components? So first, let's tackle the passing of data to a component. So in order to pass data to components, you have two ways. You can either use props or you can use init, which we tackled earlier, right? So props allows the passing of data to the child component, meaning you're going to pass data from the parent component to the child component in the form of props. Whereas init allows the passing of data to the parent component, meaning you have a child component somewhere around here, and then that child component passes the data back to the parent component itself. Also, do take note of this important line, because we will be emphasizing this later. So data can only be passed one component at a time. So what does that mean? So imagine that you have a tree of components, let's say 5 levels deep. So you have a 5 levels of components nested together, right? So you have a level 5 up to a level 1, which is the parent. Now, imagine if you're going to pass a data from the level 5 component back to the level 1. So imagine that. So let's say these are the components. You have a component here which is the level 5, and then you're going to pass that data all the way back up to level 1, which is right here, right? So in order to pass the data from the level 5 component, which is this one, this finger of mine, back to the level 1 component, which is the thumb, you have to pass through all of these levels, which are these fingers of mine, back to the topmost level. So that is the most difficult part of components. In order to pass data from the deepest component back to the topmost component, you have to pass the data between all of these 3 components. So that is a big challenge, right? So you have to traverse these 3 components just to pass the data from the deepest component back to the topmost level component. So that is one explanation. So that is how components work in terms of passing data. So in order to pass data to components, we use props, right? So in this example, you will see that we first imported the child component in the parent, right? So the left side is the parent. The left side is the parent component, whereas the right side is the child component. So you will notice at the left side, which is the parent component, that the child component is first imported, and then after importing that specific component, it is declared as a child component in the components block, which is below, which is in the components object, as you can see right here. This one, see that, right? So, can they see it? I think not. So anyway, so I can't. Okay. So you will notice that the components object in the left side has the name child component, right? So that is the component which we imported and the topmost part of the script. Next, we declared the child component as a custom element, as you can see in the template block. So there is a child component there, right? Aside from that, you will also notice the message prop, which is indicated by the colon. So we have a colon message, which is equals to message. And then that message corresponds to the data below, which is returning a specific string called yay. So that is the value that is going to get passed to the child component. So once it reaches the child component, what the child component needs to do is to first declare props. Now, props is a way of declaring that, props is in a way says that, okay, I am a child component, so I am expecting a message prop. So that is what you will insert commonly in props. The name of the variable, or the variable that will store the property itself. So if you declared the property message in the parent, definitely you're going to declare a message props in the child component in order to match them together. Now, whatever data you pass through the message prop will be passed along to the props array. So whatever it is, it can be an array, it can be an object, it will be stored there and is considered a data variable. And lastly, you can render that in the child template by using it as a value. So as you can see, we declared the message as a value in the template of the child component, right? So that is how you pass data to a component. Next, how do you pass data from the child back to the parent? So the other way around, right? So in order to do so, you need to create a specific event which is catered by emit. So let's say you are a child component and you want to pass something to the parent. So one way of doing that is to trigger an event. So here in this example, you can see that we created a button which has a click event, right? So it has an @click. And then we have a method sendBack. So when you click the button, the code calls the sendBack method in order to fire an emit. Now you might ask, what is an emit? So emit is a VueJs directive that allows components to fire events. Now, since emit is used to fire events and the child component is declared as a custom element, then we can use that as an event, or you can use that as a way to catch data from the child component. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the emit, and then we're going to set the event name, which is the pass message, and then we're going to set the values that we're going to pass to the parent component in the form of an event. Now, once you reach the parent component, you will see this specific code, as you can see right here. The syntax is wrong. So you will notice that the child component now has an syntax, which is pass message, right? So this format is not correct. So anyway, the code is corrected anyway. So whatever you set value, whatever the value you set in the emit as an event will be the same value that you will paste in the child component after you created the @sign. So pass capital M message. So that is the event name, right? So once you set that event name in the component itself, which is in the child component right here, you can now attach a method to it in order to parse whatever values the child may have sent back to the parent. So in this case, we have a parse child message method. So that method contains a parameter named message, meaning whatever the child component passes in the emit gets stored in the message variable. So whether it be an array or an object or a string or a number or whatever, it gets stored in that variable. And lastly, what we did was we simply sent an alert using that property. So as you can see, there's only two ways you can go about by transferring data from and to components. So you can either use props or you can use emit, right? So that is the only capabilities of components. But here's the problem. When the application gets bigger and bigger and bigger, your your components gets nested deeper and deeper and deeper to the point that it is hard to pass data up levels. So as you can see, here is a clear example. Imagine your data is level 3, is on the third level, and you need to pass that data back to the first level, which is the one at the top, right? So in order to do that, you need to pass the data to the second level component, which is its parent, And then that second component is going to pass that exact data to its parent again. So as you can see, we need to create two processes just to pass data back to the parent. So as you can see, passing data through deeply nested components is tedious and is very difficult to implement. Also, it is more prone to data errors because who knows what might have happened along the way. So let's say the data from the third level gets passed to the level 2, and for some unknown reason the data gets changed. The first level component will get a different type of data instead of the original data that was passed by the level 3 component. So herein comes the issue with components, wherein if there are too many levels to navigate in terms of component depth, it is very difficult to pass data. Now, with that problem, here comes Vuex. So Vuex is the solution for that specific type of problem. Now, you might ask, what is Vuex? So Vuex is a state management pattern as well as a library. What do you mean by state management pattern? Meaning, it follows the specific pattern of centralizing all your components. So imagine that you have a single container where all of your components can tap anytime and then grab data from it. So that is what Vuex does, a centralized store for all components. Also, aside from that, Vuex also has rules ensuring that the state, which is the values, can only be mutated in a predictable fashion. What do you mean by mutated? Meaning, the values in the store or the values stored by Vuex can only be changed in a predictable fashion. Meaning, no two components can modify the state at the same time. So Vuex ensures that only one component at a time modifies the state. There can never be two components that modifies the state at the same time. So with that idea in mind, you can be rest assured that the data you're storing and getting is guaranteed to be intact, meaning no data collisions is bound to happen, as well as you can be sure that no other components, there are no two components that can collide each other and modify the data, or worse, destroy the data itself. So Vuex is used mostly in building large-scale single-page applications. In our case here in company, we use them a lot because it helps us develop systems much more faster, as well as to retain the structure much better. So how does Vuex work? So here we have a simple diagram of Vuex. So imagine that you have a Vue component, right? So we tackled earlier that a Vue component is basically a single Vue file, right? So imagine you have a single Vue file. So you have a Vue file, right? So what the Vue file does is it dispatches actions. So what do you mean by that? Meaning the component is calling a specific action from Vuex in the form of dispatch. Now that action is going to call a specific API, in this case the backend, and then wait for its response. Now once that response comes back, the action will then commit a mutation, meaning it will perform a mutation. So it will go to the mutation, wherein the mutation itself will mutate the state. So you might ask, why is that? There's a key difference between actions and mutations. Mutations is the only way to modify state data, whereas actions can commit multiple mutations. So you see the difference? Mutations can only occur one at a time. Meanwhile, mutations is only a single entity. So meaning there's only one mutation. Whereas actions can call multiple mutations. Later on, we'll be discussing why is that. So going back, mutations are the only way to mutate the state, meaning to change its values. That is the reason why Vuex is considered, what do you call this? That is the philosophy why Vuex was, in the previous slide, what it means is it can only be mutated in a predictable fashion because mutations only happen one at a time. No two mutations can occur at the same time, so it is a synchronous pattern. Since synchronous, it means that the code never occurs with another, never runs at the same time with another mutation. So it runs one at a time. So now that mutations can mutate the state then re-renders the Vue components. Meaning, since the state and the Vue components are reactive, whenever changes are made to the state, the Vue component automatically updates that state. So that is what happens. Now, for now, let's discuss the, what do you call this? We can discuss now the Vuex core concepts. So, in essence, Vuex has 5 concepts, which is the state, the getters, you have mutations, you have actions, and then you have modules. So, let's start with the first, so state. So, what is a state? Vuex uses a single state tree, meaning it is a single object that contains all application level state. Meaning, the state itself is a single source of truth. What does that mean? What it means is that all your application data, or rather state for that matter, is stored in a single centralized uniform object. So that means your components knows where exactly to get those values, as well as to not anymore be worried about the occurring problem with components wherein you have to run like 3 levels upwards or downwards in order to pass data to and from components. What it means is that regardless of where you are, or regardless of how deep your components are, or wherever their hierarchy may be, they can easily access data regardless of the depth. Meaning, they all fetch the data from a single source of truth. Meaning, a single place, which is the state itself, which is Vuex. Also, Vuex follows the same rules as the data in a Vue instance. So, you can imagine the data function in the previous live stream, right? So, the data is a way of binding values to templates themselves. But the difference is data is, in a sense, a local state, right? So, it only stores values inside its own component. Whereas Vuex stores data from all over components. So you have a single source of truth which is accessible by any component anywhere at any time, meaning you won't have to worry about state management anymore. Lastly, the most important part is state is reactive. Meaning if you bind your state to the DOM itself, whatever changes made to the state will automatically reflect in your DOM. So in your template tag rather. So next would be getters. So what are getters? So getters are considered as computed properties for stores. So you can imagine a computed property, right? So a computed property is a function which is used to render or to display content in a template. So that is what a computed property is. In essence, that is how getters behave as well. So you have a, what do you call this? You declare getters on your components and then you use them as variables in your templates. So aside from that, results is also cached based on its dependencies, meaning if your DOM constantly refreshes, and at the same time your data is not moving that much, the computed property or the getters itself does not recompute anymore. It just simply returns values upon values upon values without re-evaluating its content, because it knows and it tracks if there are changes to its state. Once the state changes, that is the only time that the getters will re-evaluate, which is mentioned here, right? So it will only re-evaluate when some of its dependencies have changed, and that is the only time it will re-evaluate, meaning your content is always cached, therefore saving CPU time. Next is mutations. So mutations is the only way to actually change a state in a Vuex store. Again, for emphasis, mutations is the only way to actually change state in a Vuex store. There are no more other ways to change the state values aside from mutations. So mutations are also similar to events. So you can imagine events like @click or something like that. Let's say at parse message, for example, which is the one we created earlier. So that is an event as well. So each mutation has a string type and a handler, meaning for the mutation you have a type of mutation and then its handler. So the handler function is where the actual state modifications are performed, whereas the handler function receives the state as its first argument. So what it means is that later on we're going to demonstrate how mutations actually work and what these two last lines mean, wherein the actual state modifications are performed. So anyway, going back, since each mutation has a string type and handler, mutations are in a sense functions. So they are functions that are called by actions by using commit. So the handler function also receives the state itself, which is the previous one, which is this one, the state, as its first argument. So meaning for every mutation you have access to the state itself, regardless of, or rather allowing you to modify whatever the state may be, because mutations is the only way to modify the state, and there's no other way anymore. If you do that, what's going to happen is Vue is going to throw an error at you regarding mutations. Next, we have actions. So you will notice that actions are similar to mutations, but there are key differences. One of them is actions commit mutations instead of mutating the state. So again, actions commit mutations instead of mutating the state. What does that mean? What it means is that the actions cannot modify the state directly. Instead, it needs to commit a mutation wherein the mutation will be the one to change the state values. Now, why is that? The reason for that is actions can contain arbitrary asynchronous operations. What does that mean? So anyway, so let's clarify this a bit. Actions commit mutations, right? So in order to mutate the state in an action, you need to commit a mutation, and then the mutation modifies the state. And you may ask, why is that? That is because actions can contain arbitrary asynchronous operations, right? So asynchronous operations means that you have a specific code running forwards, and at the same time, so imagine this is your main code, right? So you're doing the actions, and then if you add an asynchronous operation, it will branch off, right? So it gets detached from the main process, but the main process still continues. So while waiting for the asynchronous operation result, the UI is constantly responsive. So that is the difference. wherein mutations have to be synchronous, meaning it needs to run one at a time, wherein it parses the lines one at a time, while actions does not have to be. Now, why is that important? Imagine a JavaScript wherein while you're waiting for the response, you can't click anywhere else. That is what happens with synchronous operations. Meaning, if you send a request somewhere outside, or if you're doing something that is taking a lot of time, your browser will not respond as long as it's not finished yet, right? So that is synchronous. That is how mutations behave. Meaning, as long as the mutation is not yet finished, other mutations cannot modify the state yet, making the code secure, or rather making the data secure and modified one at a time only. Whereas actions can contain multiple asynchronous operations, meaning it can run multiple functions and not wait for the responses, or rather wait for their responses at a later point in time and then continue on with the flow without interrupting anything at all. So that is the difference between actions and mutations. Mutations are synchronous, and they are the only way to actually change state in a Vuex store. Actions, on the other hand, are not synchronous, meaning they are asynchronous, and they commit mutations instead of mutating the state. To demonstrate why that is a problem, or why actions are like that, imagine you have 10 actions modifying a single state. What's going to happen if that is the case? Since actions can contain asynchronous operations, how do we determine who is the finish, or what function has already finished and what function has not yet finished? How do we determine the state of the Vuex if actions can modify them in a unpredictable fashion due to the reasoning that actions can have asynchronous operations? So that is the reason why mutations are synchronous, in order to make the state changes more predictable, meaning the change will only be one at a time, making it more predictable, right? So that is the reason why it is like that. Lastly, we have modules. So modules allows Vuex to divide the store, or divide your store into modules. So each module can contain its own state, mutations, actions, as well as getters. So it is one way, this is a useful feature of Vuex wherein you can divide your modules based on their functionalities. For example, login, or let's say account, or something like that. So that is one way of using modules to separate the states between certain groupings of systems. So here is a sample Vuex store. So as you can see, you simply declare a new Vuex store, and then you list the state, getters, mutations, and actions. Again, to re-emphasize, state contains the application level data, right? So you store your data inside a state. Next, the getters allows you to fetch the values of this state in your Vue components. Meaning, your getters are the ones whom you call when you need to fetch the data from the state. So that is the purpose of getters. Also, getters are reactive. Whatever the contents of the state are, that is what they feed back to the Vue components. Next, we have mutations, right? So mutations are the only way to change the state values. So as you can see here, you have two example mutations. You have the adding of the to-do item, and then you have the removal of to-do item. So the first one pushes value to the state, while the second one removes values from the state. Lastly, you have actions. So for the actions, again, actions can contain arbitrary asynchronous code, right? So it can contain code that does not follow the conventional standards of simply proceeding down the line in a code. So what it does is it can fire specific functions which are called promises, and then wait for the responses at a later point in time. So with that in mind, you can fire commits inside actions, and you can fire commits wherein the commits will be the mutations themselves. So you commit a specific mutation and then you pass values back to it. So as you can see here in our actions, we have two actions, which is to add an item and then to remove an item, wherein the two of them simply calls the mutations for adding a to-do item and removing a to-do item, including the parameters we passed to it. So that is how that is a sample Vuex store. So let's cut it from there now. For now, let's stop right there and let's demonstrate how Vuex actually works. Okay, so let's minimize that for now. Okay, so right now we're here at the training handouts, right? So what we discussed in the presentation is also included here. So this will serve as your reference in case you are confused. So you also have the image right here, and then you have what Vuex is right here. So first, let's start with setting up Vuex in a project. So here is the code-wise implementation. But first, before we get to that, we need to first install Vuex in our code base. So here is our npm, right? So here is our compiled code. So first, what we need to do is we need to stop it temporarily, like that. By pressing Ctrl plus C, you terminate, and then you press yes. We stop the serving of our Vue app. Once we do that, we need to first install Vuex. As you can see in our setting up VueJs right here. So you simply need to copy this line. So you copy this one, and then you paste it here, and then press enter. After we do that, what's going to happen is our project is now going to have a Vuex instance. So now let's just wait for it. So do you have any questions so far? Are you confused with this topic of ours? If you are kind of confused, please do let us know in the comments section below. We will let you, or rather we will help you, and we will entertain your questions as well if you have things that are confused about. So please don't hesitate and just leave a comment. So okay, so while waiting, you can ask questions, guys. So please don't hesitate. So it's still installing. So we'll be waiting for a short while. Okay, so it's almost finished. Let's just wait a little bit longer. Okay, so now that it's finished, we head back to our training handouts. So in order to set up Vuex in a project, first you need to create these two files, or rather we need to create one file rather instead of two. So first we need to create the store itself. So in order to do that, we need to add a folder in our src by simply adding a store directory, like so. Now that we have a store directory, what we need to do next is we need to add a JavaScript file. So let's name it as index.js. Okay. Now that we have our index.js in hand, what we need to do next is we head over to our handouts and we grab this snippet right here, like this one. So this is how you initialize and create a Vuex store. So going through line by line, first what we did was we imported Vue itself, and then we imported Vuex. Now that we have imported both of them, we tell the Vue application to use Vuex, which is this line right here. right? So first we imported them like this one. So we imported the code, what do you call this? The modules themselves, and then we told Vue to use Vuex. And then once it is done, your Vue app is now aware that it is using Vuex, right? So the next step would be to declare a store, meaning we're going to create a Vuex store, which is, as you can see right now, it still has an empty options. So later on we're going to populate that. So we created a store, right? And then lastly, we're going to export that store. Why is that? Well, there's a reason why we're exporting the store, because we're going to use this file in another file, which is the main file of VueJs, which is the main.js, which is this one, right? So in order to add Vuex to your application itself, what we're going to do is we're going to import our store. So let's just grab this one and then let's attach it down here. So now we have imported our store JavaScript file, right? Next, what we're going to do is we're going to add our store here, this component, inside the Vue parameters, which is here. Meaning, we're telling Vue that you create the app itself, including the store. So that is how you bind Vuex in your environment. Once you do that, your application is now basically ready for using Vuex. So before we begin, first we need to add a store state. So let's add something first to our store. So let's add something to play with. Let's say, so now we have a Vuex store, right? So let's add something like state. So let's add first the state. So now we have a state, right? But it's empty. So let's add a to-do list. And it's an array. And let's say its content is a single object for now. So let's say it has a value. Let's say code, or yes, code should do just fine. So now we have a to-do list with a single value, which is code, right? So that is a basic state already. Now that we have our own state, next, what we need to do is we can use that state in our component already. So in order to do that, simply need to add a computed property to your component. So let's use the so let's first run the serve so we can see the application. Okay. Now let's see, we can use the child component for this one. I think let's use this one. So let's say you want to use the, what do you call this? Oh no, not this one. Yes. So in this example, we want to use the to-do list, right? So we want to access to-do list in our component. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a computed property. I think it's like this. Oh no, it's not. It's like this. Yes. Oh no. Yes, so it's an object. Okay, yep. Okay. Now we have a computed property, right? So let's say to-do list. We're going to create a computed property named to-do list. And then, what it's going to do is, okay, it's still building, so let's just wait for it. So, what we're going to do with our computed is to get the value of the store, right? One way of accessing the store is by using the $store. That is one way of accessing the store values. So let's say state. So at this point you access the store, right? So again, to remind you, State is a single object containing all application level data, right? So imagine that you have a giant tree and the dollar store allows you to access that entirely. So if we use store.state, meaning we're accessing everything that the state contains. So in this case, since we only have one value in state, we can grab that to-do list. So now that is how you access the state itself. So as you can see, we have access the to-do list, right? So if I call this in the template, it will contain the array which is found inside the state, which is this one. Now since it is an array, in order to display it properly, we need to use a v4. So let's use a v4 instance. So let's add a div for now, and then let's add, let's use the unordered list again, and then let's list an item with a v4. Let's say to do in to-do list. So something like that. And then the key would be the value itself. So to do that value. So now you have a loop for the to-do list. Then lastly, what we're going to display is the to do that value, meaning the value itself, which is this one, right? So once we do that, let's see, is it finished? Okay, so now it is finished. Let's close this one. Where is it? This one. So if we refresh this one, as you can see, the component was able to access the state variable because it displayed the code, right? What happens is from here, you have the state, right? And then we access this specific state in our child component. So that means you can tap to your state at any time, at any component. So if we add a value here, let's say, and let's add another value. Let's say build, something like that. What's going to happen is it's going to render the build here as well. So now that we are able to access the state, we can now create a much more convenient way of accessing values in the form of, let's see, getters. Yes, so the next would be getters, because as you can see in our child component, creating a computed property for every state value is inconvenient, right? Why not, instead of letting outside sources dictate what they will pick, why not let the store itself dictate what they will give you instead? So that is what getters do. So it allows you to structure your values much more efficiently rather than just grabbing and binding along random, instead of directly tapping the code themselves. Because imagine if you have, or if your state is quite deep, so let's say you have a 10 level deep object. So this line is going to go on and on and on and on and on until it reaches that certain point in object. So your code is going to get a little bit messy, right? So it's going to get dirty. So to make it much more cleaner, we can add getters, wherein the getters specify what portion of the state they will give back to you. And at the same time, the data they return back to you is cached, meaning it is much more efficient and it saves computational power. So in order to create a getter, you simply need to add getters in the store, as you can see here. So we can add state, we can add getters here. So getters is an object. Next, we're going to add the function name for the getters itself. So let's say, an example, so let's say to-do list. Next, we're going to declare to-do list as a function, which contains state. Yeah, something like that. Meaning, to-do list is a function with state as its parameter. Meaning, every time you access to-do list, the function itself has access to the state. Like so. Meaning, this function has access to this. Again, let me repeat. Getters contains functions, which are this one, which contains parameters, which is the state itself. So the getter functions has the state as its first parameter. And then based on that, you can return values as much, you can filter out the values you will return using the state variable here. So in this case, we returned the to-do list, which is this one, right? So now that we have a getters, how do we use them in our component? In order to utilize them in our component, what we need to do is we need to specify the getters instead of the state. So if you can imagine here, or as you can see, we're accessing the state, right? But instead of using the state, we can use getters. Once we do that, we get the same functionality, which is right here. Even if I refresh the app, we still get the same functionality, but the difference is, for the state, there is no cached data, whereas getters, even if you refresh and if you re-render the DOM as many times as you can, as many times as you want, the values get cached, meaning they don't recompute again and again on every refresh, therefore saving you CPU power. That is that kind of philosophy is very useful for those devices which has little computational capabilities. For example, mobile phones. So this type of functionality comes in very handily in those types of devices. So now that we have our getters, it's time to add some mutations. Rather, it's time for us to add some items in our to-do list. So this is the mutations part. Like we mentioned earlier, mutations are the only way to add as well as to change, or rather, the only way to change the values in the state. So in our case, what we need to do is to simply add and then remove. So there are only two items that we need to accomplish in our mutations. So in that case, what we're going to do is we're going to create two mutations. So going back here, we're going to create mutations like this one, right? So for the mutations, we need to add and then remove, right? So let's name this to add to do item, something like that. And then the what do you call this? The parameters for the mutations is the state itself and the next value. So going in our presentation earlier, which is, where is it, around here, the handler function for the mutations, which is this one, right? So imagine that receives, it says here that handler function, which is this one, receives the state as its first parameter. Meaning, every mutation's first parameter will always be the state, and the second parameter will always be the value that you pass to the mutation itself. Later on, I'm going to show you why is that. So that's it for now. So okay. So in the mutations, what we're going to do is we're going to modify the state values, right? So if we're going to add a to-do item, obviously we're going to set the to-do list, and then we're going to add an item. When you say push, you're going to append a specific value inside an array. So you're going to add a value to the last part of the array. So in this case, we're going to add the value, whatever the content of value may be. So that is what we're going to do, right? Okay, so instead of directly adding the value, we're going to create an object. And then we're going to use the specific format, which is this one. We're going to use the same format like this one, but instead of adding a static value, we add the second parameter as the value itself. Meaning, if you call the mutation, the value that you pass to the mutation will be the one to be inserted to the state. So later on, we're going to demonstrate that for you. Next, now that we're able to add an item, obviously we need to remove an item. So remove to do item. Again, we follow the same syntax with state as the first parameter and the value itself to be removed as the second parameter. Next, we're going to directly modify the state. So state.todo list, and then we're going to use splice. Now, splice is a way of removing items from the array by specifying the index. So that means what we're going to pass in the to-do item is the index of the object. So imagine the index of this one is 0 and this one as 1. So if we pass a number 1 as value here, that is what is going to get deleted in the array of to-do list. So that is the value itself. So let's set here as value, and then let's set the second parameter to 1, meaning the number of items to remove from the list or from the array. So now we are able to add as well as to delete items in our state. So how do we use them in our components? So in order to use them in our components, you simply need to add a specific event, or you need to bind an event to an item in order to figure out what item to delete. So in this case, we're going to use the index of the array. So first, let's head over to our child component. So we have this one, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to convert this into a, what do you call this? Yes, so we're going to convert it into a tr, okay, td. Okay, so we're going to create a table. Let's say maybe not table. Let's convert this to a div instead. So maybe I'm not sure. So okay, let's see. Okay, so let's just go with tr td, something like that. So let's add a table. Like that. No. Okay, so we have a table, right? So yeah. Now we have a basic table. So if you take a look, we have a basic table right here, right? So let's set this to, okay, let's just leave it at that for now. Okay, so I think not. Let's use the div instead. It's much more cleaner to look at. So let's have a, remove this one, remove this one. Let's have a div. Yes, much better. Okay, so let's, for this one, let's set this to, let's say, let's set this to another div. Okay, so div, right? And then next, we're going to add another div, and then we're going to add a button. Button at click. Meaning, if we click the button, something's gonna happen. So in this case, we're going to assign the remove, what do you call this? Okay, so there's an, in this case, let's use the remove item. And then we're going to pass a specific value to it. Let's say index. So let's mark that as an X. So something like that. So now, okay. So if you take a look, okay. Okay, so let's instead of div, let's use span instead, and then let's use just the button. There you go, much better. Div style. Let's add some padding to, you know, padding top, let's say 50 pixels. There you go, much cleaner. It's just a quick fix. So now what we did is we created a to-do list, right? And now we have a button for removing the items. But first, we need the index in order to remove the item. So in order to get the index, we simply need to replace the to-do here with an object like this one. Or rather, we will replace it with a different value. So first, we need to type, let's see. Okay, so first, the to-do item itself, and the next, the index of that item. Since we're looping an array, for every iteration, for sure we're going to get the index, which is this one, right? So this is the one that we need in order to determine what to delete. So now that we know what item to delete, we now need to create our function, which is the remove item below. So we're going to create a method for that. So we now have a remove item, like this one. And the parameter for that is the index, right? So the index. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to commit the index. So to make it clear. So for that, what we're going to do is this dot let's see. Okay, this dot store dot commit. Meaning, we're going to access this. As we mentioned earlier, in order to use mutations, you need to commit, right? So you use commit to access mutations. So in this case, we're going to commit this specific mutation. So let's use that. So that is the commit we're going to perform. Next, we're going to pass the index as a parameter, meaning this index is coming from here, right? So we get the index in the to-do list. So here's the index of the array, and then we pass that as a parameter for the remove item method. So we have the remove item method here, right? And here is its parameter. Next, we're going to use that parameter in the commit itself. So we're going to commit the remove to do item, which is this one, and then we're going to pass the index again as its parameter. So by the time we reach this part of the code, the value of this instance right here is the index itself. So by now, you can imagine that we remove items from the state using the index, which comes from the getters themselves. So it just circles around itself. So with that, what happens is, if I click this, the item disappears. Meaning, we removed an item from the state, and then once we removed that item from the state, the getters detected that there was a change, therefore forcing a reload. Hence, as you can see, the item is no longer here. So that is how Vuex detects changes as well as refreshes content. So, is it raining? Okay, so now that we are able to delete, of course we need to add, right? So we need to add in order to delete. We cannot add without a delete, or we cannot delete without an add, right? So this time we're going to add items to our component. So we can, let's create something down here. So we can create an input down here. So we have the loop around here. So in this case, let's add a div again to move it a bit downwards. So let's say we have an input, which is a type of text, and then we have a V model of, let's say, to do entry. Oh, my bad. Something like that. So now we need to bind this to our data, right? So we need to declare data here. So like that. So we need to simply paste this here. Oh, sorry. We need to first return an object and then let's set the to-do entry as null. So upon initialization, the to-do entry here contains nothing. So if we type here, the to-do entry gets populated. So once that we've done that, next we're going to need an event. We need a button to tell the to indicate that we're going to add an item in our state. So in this case, we're just going to create a button wherein if we click that button, we're going to add item. Yes, so going to add an item. So, and then we're going to name it as add. So let's just keep things simple. Now, what we created was a button wherein whenever click adds an item, right? So we're going to create this method below. So we have this method here, and then we just add a comma here. So now we have an add item, right? So this is the method that is going to get called whenever we click the add button. So what we're going to do is we're going to commit again the same procedure, but this time instead of using the remove to do item, we're going to use the other mutation, which is the add. So in this case, we're going to add an item, and then the value that we're going to add is the to do entry. So we're going to use the no, not this one. We're going to use the to do entry to indicate that whatever the user has typed will be the one to be added to the state. So if we do that, okay, so did I use the button wrong? Okay, so let's see. I think it's not this one. I think it's labeled add. I think like this. I think it's supposed to be like this. Let's see. Oh, okay. I think it's not labeled. I think it's like this. It's supposed to be like this. Okay. So as you can see, we now have an input, right? So first we type develop. We type a string to indicate that this is the value that we're going to insert, and then we click add. As you can see, the data is now inside the state. If I click X, it gets removed from the state. So that is how you can create reactive applications using the state. And to put things into a bigger perspective, imagine that you have a, let's say, a portion where you're going to add values to your state, and then in another component, you're going to remove values from it. So you can imagine that you can access your data, which is in the state, at any component at any time. But to make the changes, or to make the state changes in the entire application much more predictable, what happens is we only commit one at a time. So we commit mutations one at a time, meaning changes occurs one at a time, or rather there are no two instances wherein the change happens at the same time. It never happens. There's just no way that that's gonna happen. Mutations ensure that there's only one change at a time. So now that we're able to add as well as remove items from our state, the last part is we need to convert those mutations into actions. So why do we do that? Again, like I said, mutations are synchronous while actions are asynchronous, meaning actions are more fitted for those types of scenarios. Also, based on the life cycle, or the the flow chart, actions are the ones who commit mutations. But that does not mean that you cannot commit mutations in your components. It is much better to let the actions do the commit themselves in order to segregate your code logic. That means all the data manipulation, which is the state manipulation themselves, only occurs inside the store instead of doing them in your component itself. Meaning, what's going to happen is you're only going to call a single function in your state or in your action, and then the action will take care of all the data changes. So that is usually the case with large-scale applications, wherein you don't need to specify all the contents or all the actions that you need to do. So imagine if you want to modify a single data, but it requires 10 steps. So imagine if you have 10 steps which are always doing the same thing again and again. So if you set those changes in the components themselves instead of creating an action, what you're going to do is you're going to have a copy-pasted code to the other components to replicate the behavior, right? Whereas if you put them inside an action, you get a single code which does the repeated thing over and over again, and then you simply call them from different components, making it much more cleaner and much more much more better, because actions can handle asynchronous code. So that is what we're going to do. So in order to add actions, we simply need to add actions again in our store. So to do that, we simply head to index.js, and then we add actions. So now we have an actions object, right? What we're going to do this time is we're going to create an action named add item. And then the first parameter of the add item is always the context. So what do you mean by context? Like this, context. The context contains, or rather, the context is basically this. Okay, to clarify, add item, right? We created an action named add item. The first parameter of an action is always the context of itself, which is the store. Meaning, if you create an action, the context will always be the store itself, which is this one. And then the next parameter is the value itself, as you can see here. So in this case, let's just set it to item to make it much more cleaner. Like that. What it means is the context contains the store, right? Meaning, if I use context.state here, I access the state inside the actions. But if I use, let's say, getters here, I access the getters as well. If I use commit, meaning I am talking about the mutations right here. So that is what it means when you add with the context as the first parameter. It allows actions to perform multiple changes to the store itself, and therefore giving actions a much more leeway or flexibility in terms of modifying the state and changing the state overall, so performing actions. So that is why it is recommended to perform your actions inside your store instead of outside, in case of the example, in the component. So in this case, we're going to tell the action to commit. What it's going to commit is the add to do item. And then we're going to pass the item itself, like so. That is what we're going to do as well with the remove item. So let's remove an item. Again, we're going to use the context as the first parameter, and then the second parameter is the index, meaning the index of the array, right? So again, we're going to use the context to perform a commit, which is the remove to do item up here, and then we're going to use the index itself as a parameter. So that is how you create actions. Now imagine this is just a simple action. There are instances that your actions can get a little bit complicated. For example, when performing API calls, let's say your front end is calling, let's say, 10 APIs for a single action. That is where asynchronous code comes in handy. Meaning, when you call that action, you're not going to wait until the 10 requests are finished already. Meaning, you're just going to fire and forget about it, right? So that is one useful case of actions. If you use that logic in the components part, your components are going to get bloated with lots and lots of requests, as well as the handling of those requests, therefore making the code much more incohesive or incoherent, right? Whereas if you put them in actions, it makes sense because you are actually getting the values to be added to the state, meaning you are still in the context of a store or state modification, meaning it makes much more sense. So now that we have these two actions, what we need to do is to simply replace our commit here with a dispatch. So we will replace this with a dispatch. Dispatch is what we will use in order to call actions. So we simply grab the item or the name here and we paste this here, and we copy this name here as well, and then we paste this here. So if we hit save, note that we are already using action. So as you can see, we have the same functionality. If I click X, same functionality as well. So we do that in order to segregate our commits inside the state only. So in terms of code lookup, you won't have to look for components which are modifying the mutations per se. Instead, you're going to take a look at the actions themselves to check where the changes are occurring. So it makes your code much more centralized and much more easier to maintain. That is why it is recommended to use actions to modify state changes using commit. So that is how you implement actions. So next would be the modules. Well, for this one, you can create modules, right? So in order to set up your store as a module, what we need to do is we simply need to convert our store, which is this one. We're going to grab this, our store, yes, like this one. We're going to set it as a module. So const module 1, let's say. So let's just pass it like that. So we have an object of modules, right? So as you can see, we have an object of modules here. So module, like this, right? So next, now that we have declared a constant named module, what we're going to do next is we're going to declare in our store modules, which is like that, as you can see here. So let's have a module A. So we're going to declare a module A here. That means we bound our module A as a module in our store. So in order to use that in our component here, we need to simply add a, what do you call this? Okay, so yeah, so actually that's it, meaning your code is now divided into several modules. Now imagine if you have different modules, let's say module A, module B, module C. So in that case, you're going to have different modules, right? And each have their own actions, mutations, getters, and as well as the state. So that is one way of segregating your stores into multiple contents, making it again much more cleaner and much more easier to maintain. So that's it for the Vuex. Okay, so can you turn on the camera? Okay, so that's it for the Vuex. So what we're going to discuss next is going to be Vue Router. So in the Vue Router, what it does is basically it allows us to specify pages based on certain rules in the URL, right? So we'll be discussing that in the next topic. So for now, we're just going to take a short break to clear things up as well here. So we will be back in a short bit. So again, so see you in a short bit. So again guys, welcome back. So for the second part of our advanced training, now that we've tackled Vuex, we will now be talking about the Vue Router itself. So Vue Router is the last piece that we need in order to build our own single page applications. Now why is that? Because Vue Router allows us to handle the changing of components based on a specific route, right? So instead of changing components manually or sticking on a single component, we specify a specific URL, and then that URL is bound to a specific component. So in order to discuss further, in order to discuss further about the Vue Router, let us start discussing Vue Router itself. So okay, let's swap. So that is so Vuex. So now let us start with Vue Router. So Vue Router. Again, what is Vue Router? Vue Router is a routing mechanism for switching components. What do we mean by that? Vue Router allows us to change components using URL paths. Therefore, it is called as a router. Also, it is used for building single-page applications. So, what do we mean by routing? So, imagine you have a URL that says something.something.com / let's say home, right? So that home itself is bound to a single component which is declared in our router section later on. So that is how Vue Router works. Let's say you have a route named another something example.org, for example, and then you have a /, and then instead of a home you have a, let's say, account or info. So let's say info. What that info is a route. Technically, the info word itself is a route, and that route is definitely bound to another component which will be rendered once you set that route. So that is how single page applications work. So you are changing your components based on the defined routes. It allows you to change components without refreshing the page at all, therefore achieving the functionality required to be called a single page application. Now, what is Vue Router? So how does it work code-wise? So in terms of code, what you need to do in a Vue Router is to import the components that will be bound in your routes. So you have, in this example, you have two components, right? The hello world and then the to-do component. So with these two components, you can set a specific path, right? So as you can see in our routes here, we have a route that specifies that is resolved to the slash, meaning the root route rather. Meaning, if you just type the domain itself and then the hashtag, what it's going to render is the component hello world. Whereas if you use the route slash to-do list, meaning like this, for example, as you can see, we have the localhost slash to-do list, it's going to display the to-do component instead. So that is how Vue Router changes components based on the path that is set. So for example, you can set it to as many lengths as you want, but regardless of the path, whatever path it resolves, there's always a component for that. So that is how Vue Router works. Now, in order to in order to change routes, what you need to do is you need to create a router link. Meaning you need to create a link that whenever you click it, changes the path itself. So as you can see here in this example, if you click the home route, if you click the home, or if you click home, the router will redirect you to the path, which is the root path itself. Whereas if you click the to-do component link, it will redirect you to the to-do list path. Meaning it will resolve to the other component instead of the first component, right? So in order to implement this, you need to first create a router link, and then next you need to declare a router view. Now what is router view? Router view is an element wherein whatever component you declare on the route will be rendered inside the router view. So later on we're going to apply this in our application. So aside from having static routes, you can also achieve dynamic routes. So dynamic routes are a type of routes which is useful for components which depends on certain parameters before rendering. For example, you have a component that requires a specific value before rendering, for example, ID. So that is a common route need. So you have a component that requires a certain value to be passed to it. So that is one useful usage of dynamic routes. So dynamic routes allows the passing of values in between routes. So the way you pass values between routes is using params. So as you can see here, if we take the previous example that we have, you will see that our to-do list has improved a bit. So you will notice that there is an ID parameter attached to the path itself. Meaning, if you use this specific URL, which is the to-do list, slash you append a number to it, or any number for that matter, that number is considered a parameter. Meaning, it is bound to the ID of the route. Now, in order to utilize that route or that value, you simply need to use $route.params, meaning the parameter, which is the colon ID, and then you set it to ID itself, meaning the value it's going to get is 1. So that is how you pass values in between routes. So that is what we call dynamic routes. So based on the URL alone, you can send parameters, or you can send values to components. So in this case, we passed an ID to the component, which is this one. So this is how you access those parameters inside a route. Next, we have programmatic navigation. Now, programmatic navigation is a way to navigate specific routes using code itself. So, one example usage of this is the route needs to be navigated using a function. So, for example, let's say checkout in a typical e-commerce website, right? So, once you click checkout, the user definitely does not click a specific link to redirect to a thank you page, right? So, the redirection happens once the function finishes its checkout function, and then that is the only time that the user is redirected to a thank you page. So that is one example of programmatic navigation. Another is your route requires dynamic parameters. For example, let's say you have a component that needs an ID, for instance. It requires an ID to display properly. So one way to achieve that is to navigate that route and then pass specific parameters to it without typing them in the URL box anymore. Another use case would be the route needs to be navigated after a certain process occurs. So that another example would be the, what do you call this, the purchase, let's say. If you purchased something online, definitely it won't send you to a thank you page immediately, right? Or let's say you went to a certain page but it is not serving that page anymore, so they redirect you back to another page instead. So you can achieve that using programmatic navigation. So how do we achieve that? So in order to implement those features, you simply need to use push. So push is the most basic navigation for the programmer. So you simply declare this $router .push, meaning you're going to push another route inside your current route. So what this means is, if you click the button for this example, so it says click navigate, right? So it's going to call the method navigate, and then the method itself is going to push another route inside the current route, therefore replacing the old route with the new route, so which is somewhere in this case. So if you read the comment as well, the path must be the same as the path declared in the route section. If you decide to set a different path from the declared, you will get a 404, meaning it did not resolve to a specific path. So in order to demonstrate, now that we have a Vue Router, now that we know what Vue Router is capable of, we need to first set up our environment to be ready for Vue Router. So scrolling upwards, in order to install Vue Router in our environment, we again stop this task for now, like this one, and then we type the specific command for installing Vue Router. So we need to simply type npm space install space vue-router and then /save. So we hit enter. Now, once the Vue Router is installed in our application, we can now use the functionalities for the Vue Router. But before we do that, while it is installing, first we need to set up our environment in order for the Vue application to detect that we have Vue Router installed in our application. So we're going to tell our application that we have a Vue Router for you to use. So we're going to use the same process that we did earlier in the Vuex in order to add Vue Router to our environment. So while waiting, if you have any questions, guys, please don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section. We will be answering all of your questions at any point in time. So please don't hesitate if you have questions. So okay, so it's still installing. So let us wait a bit. Okay, so now that it is installed, we can now head back to our project, right? So the first step that we need to do in order to set up our application to be ready for Vue Router is to obviously add the Vue Router in our project. So first, we need to set up the routes first. So in this case, we're going to create a folder named routes. So let's create a directory and then let's rename it to routes. And then inside, we're going to create a index file. So now we have an index file, right? Next, we're going to import Vue as well as Vue Router. So import Vue from Vue, right? And then next, we're going to import Vue Router from definitely Vue Router, which is like that, right? Okay, I forgot. So we need to serve. Okay, so let's just leave it there. Okay. Now that we have imported Vue and Vue Router, we're going to tell Vue to use Vue Router, similar to what we did earlier with Vuex, right? So as you can see right here. Next, now that we know that Vue will use Vue Router, what we need to do next is to tell, what do you call this? We need to inform the router that we have a component to display. Import, let's say, hello world. So let's like that. Ah, yes. Activity. Oh yes, so again, to answer Joseph's question, yes, we will have an activity both for the basic view as well as for the advanced view. Technically, the what do you call this? The mechanics for the activities are just the same. The only difference is for the basic, you're going to create a basic to-do app using the what do you call this? Using the data variables. Whereas for the advanced one, you're going to use what do you call this? Okay. I don't know. Whereas we're going to use what do you call this? For the advanced, we're going to use Vuex in combination with Vue Router to achieve a much more comprehensive VueJs app. So later on, we will be showing you what that means. So for now, let's continue with the discussion. So again, we imported hello world, right? So we import now hello world. So next, now that we have imported hello world, which is our component, and then we told Vue to use Vue Router, now we're going to declare our own routes. So first, we need to declare our own routes, like this one. So a routes is an array of objects. So meaning each object is considered a route to resolve. And then we're going to declare our router, new Vue Router, like this one, like that. Okay. Now that we have declared our Vue Router, we're going to append our routes inside the Vue Router itself. So like this one. Okay. Now that we have appended our routes to the Vue Router, we're going to export our router itself. Do note that we're not exporting the routes because the routes is just an array of objects, but rather we're going to export the router itself, which is the Vue Router object we declared right here, right? So that is how we set up our basic routes, like that. So next, we're going to bind them to our VueJs object, which is found in the main.js. So in order to bind that, we simply again follow the same principle with the Vuex itself. So instead of using the store, we import this time the router from router, routes, then index. So next, we're going to grab this router and then we're going to attach it down here. Like that. Okay, so like that. So now, as you can see, we have both the Vuex and the Vue Router inside our application. So next, we're going to declare now our routes. So now that we have declared them, now that we have our own routes, first we need to declare a basic route. So in this case, let's use the basic route, which is this route here, which is the hello world. Meaning, if we access localhost 8080, we're going to render the hello world component. Right? So that is what we're going to do. So let's say, yes, like that. So if we go back here, yes, okay, yeah. So once we do that, if we go back here, as you can see, we rendered the hello world component, right? So let's see. So no, so it's supposed to be this one. Okay. So okay. Okay, I forgot. Yes. So now that we have our routes, we now then need to declare our router view. So router view, right? So like that. Okay, so now let's remove the index because we're not going to need them anymore. Like that. So now, as you can see, we have rendered the hello world component right here, right? So in order to display this properly, or in order to explain rather, what we did was we created a router, right? Which is this object right here, the Vue Router over here. Next, we attached the routes to that Vue Router object, which is these routes right here, right? So what we did was, whenever the path, which is the root path, the slash, gets resolved, the component hello world gets loaded. And as you can see, the hello world contains a bunch of text, right? Now, what happens is, if we change the path, what happens is, instead of the application dictating what to display, the router is the one who is displaying content based on the specific routes. So, for example, as you can see, we have this one, right? So if I type some mumbo jumbo here, mumbo, as you can see, nothing gets displayed. Why is that? Meaning, what happened is, Vue Router was unable to find a route named Mumbo. But if it finds a route named Mumbo with a specific path like that, it renders a component that is attached to it. So in case of this one, let's just remove this one and hit enter again. And as you can see, we now changed back to the normal behavior, right? So in order to make things a little bit more interactive, let's add routes. So let's add another route. So in this case, let's add a to-do list. So path would be to-do list. And then the component would be the, let's see, what do you, okay, let's see, I see. So let's use the index component. So since we're going to use the index component, let's import that one. So index from the same route, same path, components, and then let's use the index. Now, what happens is, take a look at this. Now, if our route is default, as you can see like this one, it resolves to the hello world component, right? But if I type to-do list here, the component changes without refreshing the page at all. But if I remove this again, it goes back to the hello world. So, as you can see, you can change components based on the URL itself. So to make things much more interactive, let's add something to spice things up a bit. Let's add a router link instead. So to emphasize, we have an image here, right? So let's add a div here, and then let's add a router link to, let's say, an object, and then let's add a path, let's say slash, right? So that is the path it will head to once it clicks this. Now let's say home, and then let's add another router link. So router link. This time, instead of the similar path, what it's going to do is the path is the to-do list, like this one. So let's separate. No. Yeah, this should be like that. And then let's close the element. Let's say to-do list, something like that. Now, oh, there's no divider. Okay, let's see. Okay, that should. Okay. Maybe let's add another div. I'm not sure if it behaves the same. Oh, it's ugly. So anyway, it should work by that. So, okay, let's make this a little bit more presentable. Okay. Now, take note that we have two router links, right? The first router link redirects to the root path, which means home, and then the second router link redirects to the to-do list, meaning our other component, the index, right? So if we take a look at our routes, if we resolve to the slash, meaning the root one, we're going to display the hello world, right? But if we resolve to the to-do list, we're going to display the index instead, which is the other component, right? So if we click home, oh, okay, so no, that's not how it works. Where is it? Okay, so my syntax was wrong. So instead, oh yeah, I forgot this one. It should be an object. Okay, so in order to set a router link, you need to add a colon to the parameter 2 in order to bind an object. There are many ways of declaring 2. You can use string, you can use another method, but the most effective one is the object, because you can specify the path, you can specify the query objects, you can specify parameters. So it is much more effective to use the colon instead, like this one. So if we follow along, let's remove this for a bit, but that is a wrong URL, so like that. Now, what happens is, if we click to-do list, it should redirect us to the other component, right? And then if I click the home, it should redirect me back to the hello world component, like so. As you can see, we can change components without refreshing the page at all. But as you can notice, as you will notice, the URL keeps changing as soon as I change routes. So that is what you call a single page application. Now, the Vue Router allows you to change components based on the routes themselves. So it is a way of rearranging your modules into something that makes sense and ultimately leading to a single page application. So imagine you have 10 modules, for instance. And of course, you cannot, you cannot drill those 10 modules in a single route, right? You need to specify specific routes for each module. So what's going to happen is, if you have 10 modules, then you have at least 10 links, right? So you have 10 routes. So for each route, it has its own module specified to display. So in this case, we have only 2 modules, the home and the to-do list. So that is how Vue Router behaves in order to achieve a single page application capabilities. So as you can see, now we are changing components based simply by clicking links. Oh, sorry. If I click this, the home appears. If I click this, the index component renders, and then it keeps rendering like this. So aside from that, you can change routes on the fly as well, programmatically. So what does that mean? Let's say, what do you call this? let's say you finished a certain functionality. Let's say you added an item to something else, or let's say you added an item to the state. And what you want to achieve is, after you add an item to the state, you want to redirect to another route. So that is possible by achieving or by using the push. So to give an example, okay, let's see. What button can I use? We need to trigger an event which will fire a router that push. So let's add that to the child index. Let's see. Let's use this one as an example. Okay. So in the I am a child component. Okay, so not this one. Let's use the index instead. So here, as you can see, we have a hello, right? So maybe we can add a button here that when you click it, let's say its purpose is to go back, right? Go back, so something like that. And then let's say back. So if we click this button, the go back method gets called, right? So obviously, what we're going to do is we're going to add the go back here. So it is a simple method that we're going to implement, like this one. And then what the button does is basically redirect us back to the hello world. So this dot router dot push, and then you specify the path, which is this one, and that means when I click back, it redirects me to the home component, right? So to make things much more cleaner, instead of doing it that way, what we can do is we use rather the object instead. So let's say instead of passing a simple string, let's pass an object, and then let's declare the path as the slash. Meaning, if we click the button, it will redirect us to a route which has a specific path of slash. So once we do that, if we click to do list, and then I click the back button, it redirects me back to the home page, right? So that is how you create a navigation programmatically. So this is just a simple example to demonstrate. So imagine that you have a, let's say, some process here. Let's say a very long process. So what it does is, once the button is clicked, some process happens, right? So some process here occurs. And then after that process gets finished, that is the time when you call the router that push right here. So one real life use case for this one is, let's say, login. So for example, login, right? So imagine you're in a login component, and then you type your credentials, and then you press login, right? Now what it's going to do is it's going to the back end, right? It's going to call an API or whatever, and then it's going to ask for a response. It's going to wait for a response, right? Now, you're not going to immediately push another route to the home page as soon as the login is clicked, right? So you're going to wait for the process to get finished first before redirecting to another path, right? So that is one use case for the router in terms of programmatic navigation. Another is for checking off credentials. Let's say you want to make sure that only logged in users can enter this specific component. So let's say you added a function which checks for that specific login credentials, and then once it's not present, you redirect the user back to the login, right? So that is one way also of what we call a programmatic navigation. So there are many use cases where you can implement this programmatic navigation. That is why Vuex and Vue Router always go hand in hand in developing single page applications. So if you combine the capabilities of Vuex, which is state management, and at the same time you combine the capabilities of Vue Router, which is the handling of routes, you can basically create now your own single page applications. right? So all it takes is, or rather, all that's left to do is to build your components logically, and then to arrange them in a in a way that it makes a coherent sense, not just creating random components or something like that. Now, or rather, now that we are able to create our own single page application, the next step would be to implement it in our Vue.js application. Now, okay, let's go back to the Vue.js application, or Vue.js activity first. Okay, so remember our previous activity is the Vue.js, right? Okay, why is it going? Okay, so our activity is the Vue.js, right? So in our activity 2, what we need to do is we need to create a to-do app, right? So in our to-do app, the idea is to create what do you call this? To create a component that allows you to create a to-do app, or to-do list in itself. So the rules were to add a input box, right? So you type an item on the input box, you click the button to add it to the current list, and then that item is appended to the list, right? So that was the adding feature. Whereas the removing of items is by clicking on the X button, right? So that is the basic functionality of the to-do app. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to implement it, but this time we're going to use Vuex as well as Vue Router. So we're going to combine those two to create a full-fledged single-page application. Now, we're going to retain the same functionality or the same code itself. We're just twisting it a bit to use Vuex instead of Vue, or instead of the normal VueJs. Okay, so Vue, zoom. Zoom. Where's the zoom? Okay, let's see. I can't find it. So okay. Here it is. There you go. So right. So for our second activity, we will be creating a Node.js. We will be creating a, what do you call this? A application, right? The to-do app. But the rules here is that we're going to use Vue.js, we're going to implement it in Vue.js, but we're going to use Vuex as well as Vue Router. So for the Vuex, what we're going to do is we're going to implement the we're going to implement the to-do app by using the Vuex, meaning your list of to-do items will be inside the state. And then you're going to fetch your to-do items using a getter, right? So that is what it's going to be. Next is we're going to add an item using a mutation, right? Like what we did on the what we did earlier itself. And then we are going to remove items from it by clicking the X button beside the item. Meaning we're going to perform a mutation to remove the item itself in the state. So that is the criteria for the Vue.js activity this time. So earlier we we said to create a Vue.js activity, or we created a Vue.js app, right? So this time we're going to create the same app but with Vuex and Vue Router in mind. So we're going to combine the two. So that is what we are going to implement. So where is it? I think it's not. What do you call this? Oh yes. Yeah. So that's basically it. So again, to emphasize, maybe let's just type it here instead. So we need to implement the following behavior, right? Also, you will use Vuex and Vue Router from router to achieve this functionality. Okay, so the to-do list will be handled by Vuex, whereas the to-do list component will be handled by Vue Router. So that's it. So let's see. So we retain the same features and the same functionalities, but this time we will be using Vuex and Vue Router to achieve this functionality. So these functionalities. So again, to emphasize, the to-do list will be handled by the Vuex, meaning the addition and subtraction of to-do list items will be handled by Vuex alone, and then the navigation to the component itself will be handled by Vue Router. So does that make sense? I think it does. So I think that's okay. So yes. Wait, I think let's see. My suggestion would be okay, let's see. I think it's much better this way. Yes. Okay, so now that we have that, so we would like to shout out for Joseph De Leon for our you know Joseph. He's the most active participant we have in this training, and we are definitely very proud to be teaching him these things. So kudos to you, Joseph. So please do stay tuned, Joseph. We will be sending you more and more tutorials as well. So please don't hesitate to question or to ask questions as well. So again, going back to the activity. So the part 2 would be to create the following behavior, right? So you create a to-do item on an input box. The user clicks a button in order to add it to the current list, and then the item is appended to the to-do list, and then the user can remove those items in the to-do list by clicking on the X button beside the item. So that is the functionality of the to-do app. Also, to add, you will use Vuex and Vue Router to achieve these functionalities. The to-do list part will be handled by Vuex, meaning if you add an item to the list, Vuex will handle the addition of the item, and then if you remove an item from the list, Vuex will also handle the removal of the item. So that is where the Vuex part gets, that is the part where Vuex enters. Whereas, for the navigating to the to-do list component itself, it will be handled by the Vue Router. Meaning, you're going to create your own component to add, or rather, you're going to create your to-do list component. And then you will navigate to that component using a router link. So you have two links, right? So the home link, which is the hello world, the default one, and then you have the to-do list itself, which is the to-do list component. So now that is what the activity is going to be. So we will just we will clarify these instructions with the activity in mind. So we will be adding these specific rules in the activity. So So far, that's it for the advanced. So I think that covers the topics. Let's see. Yeah, I reached the end of the slide, so I think that covers the topics itself. So again, I, Joshua, thank you for listening with our VueJs training module. So thank you, everyone. So again, we will be clarifying the rules with the activity to better make the in order to clarify all of these things. So so for now we're going to first clarify the rules in the creation of the to-do app. So first, again, we're going to use the same behavior, but for the usage of Vuex and Vue Router, the to-do list will be handled by Vuex, whereas the navigation to the to-do list component will be handled by Vue Router in the form of router links. So that's it. So we will be clarifying these rules later on in time. So just to demonstrate the outputs of the previous activity, you can see here that we are right now in the GitLab repository, right? So if you take a look at this repository, which is, you just simply copy this link here, or we will provide the link down below in the comments area for this repository. You will see, or rather you will see for yourself the outputs of our trainees. So right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we have 10 branches currently submitted here. So we will be, or rather, these 10 people have submitted their outputs in the GitLab, as well as submitted their issues. So as you can see, they have opened their issues right here based on the instructions of the activities. So we will be checking all of these, as well as we will be checking for their specific branches. So for the next activity, that is what we're going to do as well. So just to give you a heads up, these 10 people are the ones who submitted the activity 1. So they are indeed a lot. So as you can see, we have 10 branches here. So so another is we will also feature another trainee from the previous training that we've had, or which is the training module that we have. Pixel8 I think it's training. Okay, so we will feature this specific trainee that we've had previously and has has achieved, or rather has passed all of those requirements for the basic software training. So as you can see here, we have a trainee, we have Jose Brian Galvo, who has passed our basic software training. You can visit this URL as well to see for yourself his outputs, as well as his his build. So if you click on the output, you will see his actual build, which we built ourselves, hosted in the cloud, so everyone can view his achievements. So as you can see, anyone who views this URL will immediately see that Jose Brian Galvo has passed our software, or our basic software training, and has an actual output to confirm that he has already passed. So if you click the output, you will see his build right here. So here is his build for his basic to-do app. So if let's add item 1, as you can see, it adds an item 1, right? So here is his actual output for the Vue to-do list app. So let's say item 2. If you click the add item, it adds again another item. And then if you click the close, or if you remove the item, the item is removed as well. So it was his actual work based on the training rules that we set, which is this activity, which is what you will be doing as well. So aside from that, he also has an output to his Quasar activity, but for to avoid spoiling the fun and to avoid spoilers as well as to have spoiler tags, we will not be displaying the outputs first. So we will be displaying it at a later point in time, or probably with the next live stream, wherein we will be discussing Quasar itself. Now, so to give you a short heads up, Quasar is let's go back to the VueJs activity, right? So to give you a short heads up regarding our next week's topic, Quasar is a VueJs framework. So imagine, right? So VueJs is a framework for JavaScript, right? But Quasar, on the other hand, is a framework based on VueJs, meaning the Quasar is a framework of a framework, if that makes sense. So meaning, Quasar is powered by VueJs. So all of the features that VueJs has, Quasar already has. But this time, Quasar has done it a step further. Quasar is not just a framework for JavaScript. It is a framework for building onto different platforms. What do I mean by that? Quasar is able to deploy or to build Electron apps, meaning it can create desktop applications, or rather desktop applications in different OSs, for example, Windows, Linux, and Mac, so iOS. It can also deploy into mobile apps, for example, Android and iOS again. It can also deploy as a progressive web application, meaning it is a PWA, or in other terms, how do you explain PWA? It is a combination of technologies that allows you to progressively upgrade your code base. You can also deploy as a single page application, which is what we're going to tackle next time. And lastly, it can deploy as a server-side rendering as well, meaning your HTML is generated on the back-end side. So all of these build modes, meaning all of these outputs, come from a single code base. Imagine, single code base. So that is what Quasar can do. You have a single project which can deploy to multiple types of platforms. That is what Quasar is capable of, and that is what we will be discussing in our next tutorial session. So I hope you stick around for that one, and be sure to hit the subscribe button to get notified when we go live in YouTube, as well as to like the Pixel8 Academy page, which is this one itself, to get notified as well when we go live for the next training session. Because the last training session is a combination of all of these things that we have learned so far. The Git, the GitLab, as well as the VueJs. In addition, we will also use the Vuex as well as the Vue Router. So Quasar is capable of all of those things. We will be using the Quasar in combination with Git and GitLab. So that is what is awaiting for you guys in the next training session. So far, do you have any questions or any inquiries regarding the activity? Please don't hesitate to comment or to leave a comment for us to answer your inquiries as well as your questions. So please don't hesitate to leave a comment, guys. So again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. We will be answering all of your questions before we end this session. So I myself hope that you have learned something from this VueJs training module that we presented today. So to recap, what we discussed was we introduced VueJs, what VueJs is, what it's capable of, and why we should use it, as well as its basic usages, and then its capabilities, right? So that's what we discussed. Also, for this afternoon session, we also discussed Vuex, meaning we discussed the module, or what do you call this, the plugin, its capabilities, as well as what problems it solves in terms of single page applications, as well as we talk about Vue Router as well. So basically we've covered everything we need so far to develop our own single page application. So if you combine all of these knowledges together, you can create your very own single page application using Vuex, Vue Router, and in combination with the basic principles of VueJs. So we at Pixel8 hope that you have learned something from this training module that we have provided you. And we do hope as well that in the future trainings, which we will have next Saturday, you will learn also how to use Quasar, which is one of the frameworks that we use here in the company. So we hope that you will learn more from our trainings. So aside from the trainings, we also have tutorial videos in YouTube regarding these technologies. So if you are subscribed to our channel, we hope that you will watch them, because you will learn how to implement these features and these functionalities as well. So okay, so I think that's it. So we really do hope that you have learned something from this training module of ours. So we thank you for your time, as well as for the chance for us to teach you these technologies. So let's see, do we have any further questions so far? Let's wait for a bit and then let's check if there are questions. So please guys, please don't hesitate to leave any comments down below for us to answer your questions, guys. So go ahead, so just throw those comments at us. Please don't be shy. So just look at Joseph. As you can see, Joseph is very active, and yeah, he's very nice. So please don't hesitate, just leave a comment down below. So we'll be answering them as well. So okay, so far there are none. Okay, so let's see. Let's wait for a few minutes. So dun, dun, dun. Okay, so again guys, please don't hesitate to leave a comments down below. So we are always here and we will be active while we wait for your comments. So we still have around 3 minutes before we end this training, this training stream, and please don't hesitate to leave a comment. So we are active as well in the comment section, so we will be answering all of your questions. So please don't hesitate and just keep asking questions. So again guys, in behalf of our company Pixel8, I myself would like to thank you for watching this live training session, which is entitled the Basic Software Training Program. So I would like to thank you for attending our VueJs training module, as well as we hope as well that you have learned something from this training module that we have provided. So that is our ultimate goal in this live training modules. We hope that you have learned something from our we hope that you have learned something to implement your own applications, as well as to give you an insight as to how the modern technology works, as well as we hope that you will be able to build successfully your own single page applications using Vuejs, as well as in the later parts we really wish that you will tag along with us in our journey to the third day, towards the third day of the training, which is for the Quasar itself. So we hope you still tag along with us with that training session. So in the Quasar part, again, we will be tackling about the Quasar framework itself. So please do stay tuned for that. So what do you call this? So for those of you who are still or for those of you who have stick to this end of the stream and not yet subscribed to our channel, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to get notified when live trainings have already started streaming. As well as for those of you who have not liked yet our Facebook page, please do like the Pixel8 Academy page in order to get notified also whenever our live training sessions start broadcasting. So aside from those, we also have tutorial videos that we upload on our YouTube page. So we hope that you will watch those as well, and we hope that you will learn something from those tutorial videos as well. So again, I, Joshua Hadji from Pixel8, would like to thank you for attending this Vuejs training module. Again, this is Joshua from Pixel8. See you in the next tutorial, Pixel8’ers.